Before we dive in, I want to give a warm welcome to our newest subscriber, June Walker. June, we are so glad you found this community. This story is for everyone who has ever been overlooked by the very people who were supposed to see them most clearly. Welcome home. The estate lawyer slid a single sheet of paper across the table and said, according to the amended will, you received the warehouse. My brother smiled into his coffee cup. My sister-in-law examined her nails. And I sat there holding a document that described a property everyone in that room had already written off as worthless. Everyone except me, because I was the only one who had ever actually walked inside it. What I found changed everything, but not in the way anyone expected. My mother used to say that every family has a spine. One person who holds the whole structure upright while everyone else gets to stand tall and take the credit. She said it like it was a compliment. She was looking at me when she said it. I was 11 years old, standing at the kitchen sink with dish soap up to my elbows, and I remember thinking that being the spine sounded important. It took me another 20 years to understand what she actually meant. The spine does not get to dance. The spine just holds. My name is Carol. I am 63 years old. And for the better part of 4 decades, I was the invisible architecture of a family that called itself close-knit, but functioned more like a corporation with bad management and no HR department. There were 4 of us. My father, Raymond, who was a proud man in the way that men of his generation were proud, which is to say he wore his dignity like a suit he could not afford to dry clean, but refused to take off. My mother, Evelyn, who loved us all fiercely and unequally in the specific way that mothers sometimes do when they are trying to compensate for a husband who shows love through expectation rather than expression. My brother, Mitchell, who was born first and never let any of us forget it. And me. Mitchell was what my mother's church friends called blessed. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and charming in the effortless way that makes other people feel like the charm is being done specifically for them. He remembered names. He laughed at the right moments. He could walk into a room full of strangers and within 20 minutes have 3 business cards, 2 dinner invitations, and someone's cousin's phone number for a real estate deal that would almost certainly fall through, but would be talked about for months. My father looked at Mitchell the way some men look at a mirror that finally shows them what they always hoped they looked like. It was reverent. It was complete. It was the kind of approval I spent my entire childhood trying to understand and my entire adulthood learning to stop needing. I was not invisible in the dramatic, cinematic sense. I was not locked in a room or denied education or treated with cruelty. What happened to me was quieter and therefore harder to name. I was simply assumed. My competence was the wallpaper of our family life. Everyone lived inside it. No one noticed it. When the property taxes came due on my parents' house, my father would put the envelope on the kitchen counter, and somehow, without a single word being exchanged, I would end up at the county assessor's office by Thursday. When my mother's pharmacy insurance stopped covering her blood pressure medication, it was my phone that rang. When Mitchell's first business venture collapsed and he needed someone to help him draft letters to creditors without making it look like a collapse, he called me at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and I sat at my kitchen table until 2 a.m. rewriting his financial narrative in language that was honest enough to be legal and careful enough to save his reputation. He never asked me how I was doing after that. He sent a gift basket, cellophane wrapped, store-bought, with a card that said, "Couldn't have done it without you, sis." I still have the card somewhere. I kept it not out of sentimentality, but because even then, some part of me knew I might need the receipts. The warehouse came into our lives the way most complicated inheritances do, quietly and attached to paperwork. My parents had purchased it in 1987, one of those decisions that made perfect sense at the time and became increasingly difficult to explain as the decades passed. My father had visions of a small distribution business, something modest, something to leave behind. The business never materialized. Life intervened the way life does, but they kept the property. They paid the taxes on it every year, and every year it sat on the edge of the industrial district, like a promise that had forgotten what it was promising. When my father passed in 2009, the warehouse stayed in the estate without resolution. My mother was too grieved to deal with it, and Mitchell was too busy performing grief at the funeral to deal with anything practical. So I dealt with it. I organized the estate filing. I coordinated with the attorney. I made sure the property taxes stayed current. I drove out there once a year just to look at it, just to make sure the locks were holding and the roof had not caved in. And every time I stood in front of that heavy rolling door, I felt something I could not quite name. Not pride exactly, more like a sense of obligation. The way you feel about a family member who is difficult and expensive and inconvenient, but still yours. Mitchell came to those estate meetings the way he came to everything, late, confident, and already certain of the conclusion. He would sit across from the attorney with his reading glasses pushed up on his head and his phone face up on the table, and he would nod at things he had not read and agree to things he had not considered, and then afterward he would clap the attorney on the shoulder and say something about getting lunch sometime, and the attorney would smile the smile of a man who knows he will never get that lunch. I want to stop here and ask something, because I have a feeling this is landing somewhere familiar for a lot of you. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or your state in the comments, because I want to know who is in this room with me. I have a feeling we are more alike than we know. Mitchell's attitude toward the warehouse shifted the year my mother's health began to decline. Suddenly the property was not a burden. Suddenly it was an asset. Suddenly he had opinions about zoning and market value and the cost per square foot of industrial real estate in that corridor. He started talking about it at Sunday dinners like it was his idea, like he had been stewarding it all along, like the decade of tax payments and annual inspections had happened by themselves. He spoke about it with the easy authority of a man who has never actually done the work, but has watched other people do it long enough to feel fluent in the language. My mother, bless her heart, was 81 and tired and wanted peace above everything else. She was of a generation that believed family conflict was a kind of failure, that disagreement was a character flaw, that the goal of a family was to appear unified even when it was fractured down to the foundation. So when Mitchell started suggesting that the warehouse should be folded into a joint holding between the two of us with him as the managing partner, she nodded. She thought she was keeping the peace. She did not realize she was signing off on an erasure. I did not yell. I did not cry at the dinner table. I said, clearly and calmly, that I had concerns about the structure of the agreement and that I would like the attorney to review any changes before anything was signed. Mitchell looked at me the way he had been looking at me since we were children, with that particular brand of patient condescension that says, I am humoring you because we share DNA. He said, Carol, this is a family decision, not a negotiation. And my mother reached over and patted my hand like I was still 11 years old standing at the sink with soap on my elbows. That was the moment. Right there. That hand pat. That small, gentle, devastating dismissal wrapped in love. I looked at my mother and I understood something I had been circling for years. She did not see what she was doing. She genuinely believed she was smoothing things over. In her mind, a quiet Carol was a comfortable Carol. She had spent so long counting on my steadiness that she had stopped checking whether the steadiness was costing me anything. That is the thing nobody tells you about being the responsible one in a family. They do not sideline you because they think you are weak. They sideline you because they know you will handle it. They take your competence and they mistake it for contentment. And by the time you realize what has happened, your name is not on a single document you built with your own two hands. If you have ever been the one who handled everything and was thanked for nothing, Type "I know this role" in the comments. Because what happened next at the estate reading after my mother passed is something I was not prepared for. And I have been through a lot. My mother passed on a Tuesday morning in early April, which felt wrong because April is supposed to be about beginnings. The hospice nurse called me at 6:47, and I know the exact time because I had been awake since 4, sitting in my kitchen with a cup of tea that had gone cold, feeling the particular dread of someone who knows a phone call is coming and cannot stop it. I drove to the facility alone. Mitchell arrived 40 minutes later with his wife, Pamela, who was wearing a silk blouse and full makeup at 7:30 in the morning, which told me everything I needed to know about how she had spent those 40 minutes while I was holding my mother's still warm hand and telling her it was all right to go. The funeral arrangements felt to me the way everything always felt to me. Not because anyone assigned them to me, but because I was already on the phone with the funeral home before Mitchell had finished parking his car. I chose the flowers because my mother had once mentioned in passing, 11 years earlier, that she found lilies at funerals depressing. I chose them anyway. The white roses she actually loved because I had been paying attention when no one else was. Mitchell approved the program I designed with a single nod, and then spent the reception telling stories about himself that somehow circled back to how much he had sacrificed for the family. I stood near the food table and refilled the coffee urn 3 times and smiled at people I barely recognized and accepted condolences with the practiced steadiness of a woman who has been performing steadiness her entire life. The estate reading was scheduled for 2 weeks after the funeral. I was not worried. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. I walked into that attorney's office without armor because I did not believe I needed it. I had done the work. I had the history. I had been the one on the phone, at the counter, in the parking lot, at the kitchen table. I had paid the taxes on that warehouse 8 years running after my father passed. I had the bank statements to prove it. I sat down in that leather chair across from the attorney, a careful, measured man named Gerald Hines, who wore bow ties and spoke in the slow cadence of someone who has delivered bad news so many times he has learned to make it sound like weather. And I folded my hands in my lap, and I waited. Gerald opened the folder. He read the standard language first, the part about being of sound mind, the part about love and gratitude to the family, and I watched Mitchell across the table straighten almost imperceptibly in his chair the way a man does when he already knows the ending of the movie. The house, my mother's primary residence, went to both of us jointly. The savings account, modest but real, split equally. Her jewelry to be divided by mutual agreement. And then Gerald paused, just a half beat, the kind of pause that is not accidental, and he said, "The warehouse property and all associated holdings are bequeathed in full to Mitchell Raymond Holt as sole beneficiary, given his role as primary steward of the family estate." I heard the words. I understood each one individually, but for a moment my brain refused to assemble them into meaning, the way you sometimes read a sentence 3 times before it lands. Primary steward. I turned the phrase over like a stone. Primary steward. Mitchell, who had not driven past that building in a decade. Mitchell, who did not know the name of the county assessor's office or the account number the tax payments came from, or the fact that the east-facing window on the 2nd level had a crack that I had paid a contractor $400 to seal in 2019, so the frame would not rot through the winter. Mitchell, who had showed up to exactly 0 of the annual inspections, who had contributed exactly $0 to the carrying costs, who had expressed interest in the property for the first time only when someone whispered the words market value within earshot. That Mitchell was the primary steward. I looked at Gerald. I kept my voice level, because losing your composure in front of a man in a bow tie who is reading your erasure out loud feels like giving away the last thing you have left. I said, "Gerald, I would like to understand the basis for that designation." Gerald did not flinch. He said, "The amendment was made 14 months ago, Carol." Your mother signed it in this office with 2 witnesses present. Mitchell was already looking at his phone. 14 months ago. I did the math in my head. 14 months ago, my mother was still living alone. She was slowing down, but she was sharp. She was still doing her own crossword puzzles and arguing about the news, and calling me every Sunday at exactly 2 in the afternoon. She was also, I now realize, being visited regularly by Mitchell, who had started dropping by her house with Pamela on Saturday mornings, bringing coffee and pastries, and the particular attentiveness of a man who has recently discovered that an elderly parent is an asset worth cultivating. I had thought it was tenderness. I had been grateful for it. I had told my friend Dorothea that Mitchell was finally stepping up, and Dorothea had said, in that specific way she has, that means she sees something I am not ready to see yet. I drove home from that office in complete silence. I did not turn on the radio. I did not call anyone. I drove through the flat afternoon light with both hands on the wheel, and I felt something moving through me that was not quite grief and not quite rage. It was more like a recalibration. The feeling of a compass needle swinging hard before it finds north. I spent 3 days pulling records. I went through every bank statement from the past 8 years. I printed the county tax payment confirmations, 17 of them, all from my personal checking account. I found the contractor invoice for the window seal. I found the email chain from 2017 where I had coordinated with a city inspector about a zoning compliance question and spent 4 hours on hold across 2 days to get it resolved. I organized everything into a binder with tabs, the way I had organized every important thing in my life, methodically, completely, and without anyone asking me to. I called Gerald Hines and requested a follow-up meeting. He gave me 30 minutes on a Thursday afternoon. I sat across from him and I opened the binder and I walked him through it page by page. The payments, the inspections, the maintenance records, the correspondence. I laid it out the way you lay out evidence when you still believe that evidence is the point. Gerald listened. He kept his hands flat on the desk, and he listened to all of it, and when I finished, he said, "Carol, I hear you, and I want you to know that your contributions are not in question." I waited. There is always but when someone begins a sentence that way. He said, "But the will as amended is a legal document executed by your mother while she was of sound mind, with proper witnesses, and absent a demonstrated finding of undue influence or diminished capacity at the time of signing. The document stands." Undue influence. I turned that phrase over too. It is a legal term that means someone leaned on a vulnerable person until they bent in the direction that person wanted. It is also in practice nearly impossible to prove when the leaning happened in a living room over coffee and pastries, and the particular tenderness of a son who decided to show up just long enough to get his name on a document. I asked Gerald what my options were. He told me I could contest the will, which would require an attorney, a filing, a timeline of months or years, and evidence of incapacity or manipulation that would be difficult to establish given that my mother had been, by every clinical measure, competent at the time of signing. He said it gently. He said it the way doctors say there is nothing more we can do, with professional compassion and complete finality. I called Mitchell that evening. I want you to know I was not calling to fight. I was calling because some part of me still believed, even then, that if I spoke to him plainly, brother to sister, human to human, he would hear me. He picked up on the third ring. He sounded relaxed. He sounded like a man who had eaten a good dinner and was enjoying his evening and was mildly inconvenienced by the interruption. I said, "Mitchell, I need to talk to you about the warehouse. About what's fair." He said, "Carol, Mom made her wishes clear." I said, "Mom made a decision that someone helped her make, and you know that." There was a pause. Not the pause of a guilty man. The pause of a man deciding how much patience to perform. He said, I am going to pretend I did not hear that. Get some rest. You have been through a lot. And he hung up. I sat there holding the phone. I thought about calling back. I thought about the binder on my kitchen table with its 17 tabbed sections. I thought about the Sunday phone calls and the crossword puzzles and my mother patting my hand at that last dinner like I was still a child who needed soothing. I thought about the lilies she did not want and the white roses I chose because I had been listening. And I understood something then that I had been refusing to understand for most of my life. They did not want the truth. They never had. They wanted the comfort of a version of events that kept everyone in their assigned positions. Mitchell as the visionary, me as the spine. The truth was inconvenient to that arrangement because the truth had my name on it, and my name apparently was the one thing they had decided the family could afford to lose. I did not contest the will. I want to be honest about that too, because I think the honest version of this story is more useful than the heroic one. I did not contest it because I looked at the cost, financial and emotional, and I looked at my own reserves, which were not limitless, and I made a practical decision. I would not spend years of my life and thousands of dollars I did not have fighting a legal battle in a system that was not designed to measure what I had actually contributed. I would not give Mitchell the satisfaction of watching me bleed out in a courtroom over a building he had never once maintained with his own hands. I would not do it. What I would do instead was something quieter, something that required patience and precision and the specific kind of attention that had always been my greatest strength and everyone else's most overlooked resource. I accepted the warehouse. When Gerald's office called to inform me of the final asset distribution, I told them I understood the terms. When Mitchell called 2 weeks later, cheerful and magnanimous the way Victors sometimes are, to ask if I wanted to come by the house for Sunday dinner, I said I appreciated the invitation. I said I was busy. I said maybe another time. I kept my voice warm because warmth costs nothing and reveals nothing, and I had learned from the best. My mother had kept her voice warm for 60 years while the house reorganized itself around her without asking permission. I could manage a phone call. What Mitchell did not know, what he could not have known because he had never once considered me worth tracking, was that I had already driven out to the warehouse 3 days after the estate reading. I had gone alone in the early morning before the heat settled in, with my coffee in one hand and my spare key in the other. I had stood inside that dim, dusty space, and I had looked at it the way I had always looked at complicated problems, not with despair, but with the quiet, methodical attention of someone who knows that the answer is already in the room. You just have to be willing to look past what everyone else decided was worth seeing. I was looking, and something in that warehouse was already looking back. I need to tell you about the 7 years between that morning in the warehouse and the day everything changed, because people always want to skip to the moment the scales tip. They want the revelation, the confrontation, the look on the villain's face when the curtain pulls back. And I understand that. I want that too sometimes. But if I skip those 7 years, I rob you of the part that actually matters, because those years were not empty. They were not a waiting room. They were the whole education. They were where I became someone Mitchell had no framework for, because he had only ever known the version of me that held things together quietly and asked for nothing and accepted whatever was handed to her with a smile that cost her more than anyone ever bothered to calculate. So let me take you back to the beginning of those years, because the beginning is where the real story lives. The first thing I did in the weeks after the estate reading was get very still. I do not mean that metaphorically. I mean I stopped making unnecessary noise in every sense of the word. I stopped calling Mitchell. I stopped rehearsing arguments in my head. I stopped writing the letter I had started 4 times and deleted 4 times, the one where I laid out every contribution and every grievance in careful, documented paragraphs, the one that would have made me feel momentarily powerful and ultimately changed nothing. I let the silence expand. And in that silence, I started to hear things I had been too busy to hear before. The first thing I heard was that I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. It was the exhaustion of someone who has been performing competence as a survival strategy for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to do something simply because she wanted to. I had spent 40 years being useful. I had optimized myself for other people's comfort and called it strength. And sitting alone in my apartment in those first quiet weeks, with no estate to manage and no crisis to navigate and no one calling to ask me to fix something, I felt the unfamiliar and slightly terrifying sensation of having nothing to hold up. It felt like stepping off a treadmill after a very long run. The ground feels strange. Your legs do not know what to do with stillness. The second thing I heard was something I had pushed to the back of the room for years. A question. A small, persistent, inconvenient question. What do you actually want, Carol? Not what does the family need. Not what is the responsible thing. Not what will keep the peace. What do you, specifically, want for the remainder of your life? I was 56 years old when I first sat with that question long enough to let it answer itself. That is not a small thing to admit. It is, in fact, the kind of thing that makes you want to go back and have a very serious conversation with your younger self. But the younger self was doing the best she could with what she knew, and I had made a decision somewhere in those first silent weeks that I was done spending energy on regret. Regret is just grief wearing a productivity costume. It feels like doing something, but it is only ever looking backward, and I had spent enough of my life looking in directions that did not lead anywhere I wanted to go. I started small. That is the honest answer to the question of how I rebuilt. I started embarrassingly, humblingly small. I took a watercolor class at the community center on Wednesday evenings. I had not painted since high school. I was not good at it. My first attempts looked like crime scenes interpreted by someone who had only ever heard about color secondhand. But there was something in the act of doing something badly without consequence that felt revolutionary. No one was depending on the quality of my watercolors. No one's taxes were going to go delinquent if I mixed the wrong shade of blue. I sat at that long folding table with women and a few men who were mostly older than me, and we painted badly together, and the instructor, a small patient woman named Rosaria, who wore paint-stained overalls and spoke about color like it was a living thing, told me once that I was holding my brush like I was afraid it was going to do something wrong. She said, "Loosen your grip. Let it move." I thought about that for a week. And I tell you this because I believe in the usefulness of honesty, started seeing a therapist. Her name was Dr. Anita Burgess, and she was 61, just a few years older than me. And she had the specific quality of stillness that comes from decades of sitting with other people's pain without absorbing it. I sat in her office every other Thursday, and I talked about my mother and my brother and the warehouse and the binder with 17 tabs and the hand pat at the dinner table and the gift basket with the cellophane and the card that said, "Couldn't have done it without you, sis." I talked about all of it. And Dr. Burgess listened and occasionally asked questions that were so precisely aimed they felt less like questions and more like scalpels. She asked me once, about 4 months in, "When you think about the warehouse, what feeling comes up first?" I said, "Responsibility." She said, "And underneath that?" I sat with it. I said, "Grief." She nodded like I had gotten an answer right on a test I did not know I was taking. She said, "You grieve things you love, Carol, not things that are simply obligations." That was the moment I understood that I did not just manage that warehouse out of duty. I had loved it in the strange, quiet way you love something that cannot love you back, but that holds a shape that matters to you. I had loved what it represented, the only physical thing my parents had built that still stood. And Mitchell had taken it not because he understood its value, but because he could. That distinction I learned slowly and at considerable emotional expense was the difference between someone who sees the world as something to steward and someone who sees it as something to own. I want to pause here for just a moment because I know this community reaches people in all kinds of places, and I always love knowing who is in the room with me. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city, your state, even just your country in the comments. I mean that genuinely, because I think the people who find their way to stories like this one are a specific kind of person, and I want to know where you are sitting right now, what corner of the world you are watching from, because this story belongs to you too. Now, year 2. This is where things began to move, slowly, the way glaciers move, in a direction that is invisible until suddenly it is not. I had kept the key to the warehouse. That is the detail that mattered. When the estate settled and the property transferred to Mitchell's name, no one thought to ask for my key. Mitchell did not inventory the keys because Mitchell did not think about operational details. He thought about ownership, which is a different thing entirely. Ownership is a document. Operations are the 1,000 invisible decisions made by the person who actually shows up. I still had the key because I was the person who had always shown up, and so when I drove out to the warehouse on a Saturday morning in October of that second year, with a thermos of coffee and a legal pad, I told myself I was going there simply to think. To sit with the grief I had finally named and let it breathe in the place it was attached to. What I actually did was start taking notes. I walked the perimeter first. The east window seal I had paid for was holding. The roof showed no new deterioration. The loading dock door needed its hinge oiled, which I made a note of, not because it was my legal responsibility, but because the habit of attention is not something you can simply switch off after 40 years. I went inside. I stood in the center of the main floor with my coffee and my legal pad, and I looked at the space the way you look at something you are trying to memorize. The concrete floor, the industrial ceiling with its exposed trusses, the old breaker box on the far wall, the geography of the place, the way the morning light came through the barred western windows and laid itself across the floor in long rectangular strips that moved slowly as the sun climbed. And then I noticed something I had not noticed before. Or rather, something I had noticed before but filed away as irrelevant because the room at the time had seemed uniformly derelict. The back corner of the warehouse, the northeastern corner, was shorter than the rest of the space. Not dramatically, not in a way that would announce itself, but the ceiling in that corner dropped by approximately 2 feet, and the wall that created that drop was newer than the surrounding walls. The brick pattern of the original structure was rough and irregular, the kind of brickwork done by hand in a different era. But this wall was smooth. It was drywalled, and drywall in an otherwise unrenovated industrial space is not an accident. I walked to it. I put my hand flat against the surface. It was cool, which in an unventilated warehouse in October was not unusual. I knocked on it with my knuckles the way you knock on a door when you are not sure anyone is home. It did not sound hollow exactly. It sounded dense, insulated, like something behind it was absorbing the sound rather than letting it return. I made a note on my legal pad. False wall or partition, northeastern corner. Newer construction. Possible storage cavity. I underlined it once, then thought about it and underlined it again. I did not break through it that day. I want to be clear about that because I think the story is more truthful this way. I did not immediately grab a crowbar and solve the mystery. I went home. I made dinner. I called Dorothea and told her I had been to the warehouse, and she said, "Carol, that property is not yours anymore." And I said, "I know." And she said, "So why do you keep going back?" And I said, "Because I have not finished looking at it yet." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "All right," which is one of the things I love most about Dorothea. She knows when a question has been answered in a language she does not need to translate. I went back for more times over the following year. Each time I brought my legal pad. Each time I stood in front of that northeastern wall and added to my notes. I measured it on my third visit with a tape measure I kept in my car. The cavity behind the drywall, based on the external dimensions of the building compared to the internal floor plan, was approximately 40 feet deep and 60 feet wide. That is not a storage closet. That is not a forgotten room. That is a space someone designed deliberately and concealed carefully and maintained, I was increasingly certain, actively. Because on my fourth visit, in the depth of winter when the warehouse should have been at its coldest, I noticed that the wall was not cold. It was not warm exactly, but it was temperature controlled in a way that the rest of the building emphatically was not. Something behind that wall was being kept at a specific temperature, and whatever required that level of care was not garbage. If you appreciate stories that speak to real family dynamics, to the years that happened quietly between the betrayal and the reckoning, consider subscribing, because what I found when I finally broke through that wall is the reason we are all here. And I have not even gotten to the part that made my brother go completely silent for the first time in his adult life. Year 5 brought the first real collision, not with Mitchell, but with myself. I had been doing well, genuinely well, in the way that is more durable than the performed wellness I had offered the world for most of my life. The watercolors had gotten better. Not good, but better. Dr. Burgess and I had moved from excavation to construction, from pulling up roots to figuring out what to plant. I had taken on a part-time consulting role with a property management firm, work that used the organizational skills I had spent a lifetime giving away for free and paid me an actual salary for them. I had painted my bedroom a color called dusty sage that my mother would have called too bold and that I thought about every morning when I woke up with a feeling that took me months to correctly identify as contentment. And then Mitchell called. He had not called in 14 months. I knew the exact number because I had stopped counting at 12 and then started again when he didn't call at Christmas. He called on a Tuesday in March and his voice had a quality I had never heard in it before, something underneath the confidence, something he was working hard to keep out of the register of the call, but that I heard anyway, because I had been listening to Mitchell's voice my entire life and I knew every instrument in that orchestra. It was worry, real worry. Not performative concern, not the strategic vulnerability he deployed when he needed something. Actual unmanaged worry. He said, "Carol, I need to talk to you about the warehouse." I said, "All right." He said, "I had a developer contact me. They want to buy the land, and I think we should discuss it as a family." That word, we. After 5 years, we. I let it sit in the air between us for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then I said, "Of course, Mitchell. Let's talk." And I kept my voice warm because warmth costs nothing. And because I already knew something he did not know. And because the most powerful position in any negotiation is the one where only one person at the table understands exactly what is at stake. I had been back to the warehouse the week before his call. I had brought a crowbar. I want to take you back to the morning I brought the crowbar, because that morning deserves its own account, its own careful telling. The way certain mornings do when you understand later that they were the hinge point. The exact moment where everything that came before and everything that came after balanced on a single decision. It was a Wednesday, early March. The kind of morning that cannot decide if it is still winter or already spring. The sky a flat pale gray. The air cold enough to see your breath, but with a faint undercurrent of something warmer underneath. Like the season was changing its mind slowly and did not want to announce it prematurely. I drove to the warehouse alone. I always went alone. I had told no one I was going. I parked on the street, walked to the heavy rolling door, used my key, and let myself in. The main floor smelled the same way it always smelled, of old concrete and dust, and the particular metallic stillness of a large space that does not get enough air circulation. I stood for a moment and let my eyes adjust. I had brought my thermos, my legal pad. and a crowbar I had purchased 3 weeks earlier from a hardware store 2 towns over. I want to be honest about why I bought it 2 towns over. It was not paranoia, exactly. It was precision. It was the recognition that whatever I was about to discover behind that wall was going to matter, and that matching things deserved to be approached carefully, without a trail of decisions that could later be characterized as impulsive or trespassing or anything other than what they were, which was a woman in possession of a key and a history and a very specific hunch that she had been methodically building toward for 5 years. I walked to the northeastern corner. I stood in front of the drywall partition, and I looked at it for a long moment, the way you look at a door you have been standing outside of for a long time before you finally knock. My notes said the cavity was 40 feet deep and 60 feet wide. My notes said the wall was temperature controlled. My notes said the single breaker I had identified as hot to the touch in the old industrial panel was labeled Zone 4, and that it had not tripped once in 5 years of monthly utility bills that Mitchell was, I happen to know from a source I will get to, consistently not paying on time. I set my thermos on the floor. I picked up the crowbar. I found the seam where the drywall met the original brick of the eastern wall. I jammed the flat end of the crowbar into the gap, and I pulled. The drywall resisted for exactly 1 second, and then gave way with a sound like a sharp exhale, like the building had been holding its breath. A section about 3 feet wide crumbled and fell inward, and the air that came through that gap stopped me cold. Not because it was cold, though it was precisely, deliberately, mechanically cold in a way that the rest of the warehouse was not. It stopped me because of what came with it. The smell was different, clean, filtered. The smell of air that has been carefully managed, cycled, dehumidified, maintained. The smell of preservation, of intention, of something being kept alive on purpose. I widened the hole. I worked methodically, pulling sections of drywall away, stacking them to the side, exposing the opening in deliberate increments the way you open something you suspect is fragile. When the gap was wide enough to step through, I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the flashlight I had brought, a good one, a solid beam, the kind you buy when you are not certain what you are going to need to see. I clicked it on. I stepped through. The space on the other side was not what a warehouse feels like. It was what a museum feels like after hours, that same quality of hushed, temperature-managed darkness, that same sense of objects present and waiting. The walls were lined with industrial dehumidifiers, large gray units stacked too high, their green indicator lights blinking in slow, steady rhythms like the heartbeats of sleeping things. They were the source of the hum I had been hearing faintly through the wall on my last 2 visits, a low, constant sound that I had initially mistaken for street noise or a distant generator. The ceiling was lower in here than in the main warehouse, deliberately dropped with insulated panels, which explained the exterior dimension discrepancy I had measured. The floor was clean concrete, treated, sealed, which in a building this old was not original. Someone had poured it. Someone had built this room with serious intention and serious money, and then buried it behind plywood and drywall and the assumption that no one would ever look closely enough to find it. I moved my flashlight beam across the room, and that is when I saw the first one. It was in the far left corner, and my beam hit it, and my brain took a fraction of a second to process what I was seeing, because what I was seeing did not belong in a context like this one. In an industrial warehouse in a fading district of a mid-sized city, in a room that smelled of careful preservation and was lined with the quiet machinery of climate control. What I was seeing was a car, enclosed in a large inflatable transparent capsule, the kind used for long-term preservation of high-value vehicles, the kind that creates an airtight microenvironment to prevent oxidation and moisture damage. The kind that costs more than most people's used cars just for the capsule alone. And there was not one. There were 12. 12 capsules arranged in 2 rows of 6, lined up with the precision of a collection that had been planned, not accumulated. I stood very still. I moved my flashlight from capsule to capsule, and I counted them twice because I needed to be certain my eyes were reading the room correctly and not constructing something out of expectation. I walked to the first capsule on the left. The plastic was thick and slightly clouded with age, but still transparent enough to see through clearly if you got close. I got close. I pressed my face near the surface, and I directed my flashlight beam through the plastic and onto the car inside. It was dark green, a deep, specific, unmistakable shade of dark green that car people have a name for, Highland green. The same color as a very specific, very famous vehicle that most Americans of a certain generation would recognize, not because they are car enthusiasts, but because they have seen it on a screen, cornering hard through the streets of San Francisco. In a chase sequence that film historians still discuss as one of the most technically accomplished in cinema history. I looked at the body lines, the fastback roofline, the set of the rear haunches, and then I looked at the rear bumper. There was a dent, an unrepaired, distinctive, specific dent in exactly the location that photographs and documentation from the film's production had always described. My flashlight hand was completely steady. My breathing was not. I moved to the second capsule. Red. A red so saturated. In particular, it looked less like paint and more like something that had been distilled from every other red that had ever existed. A Ferrari. Long and low and sculpted with the specific arrogance of Italian engineering from an era when cars were still hand-formed. I directed the beam to the front grille, to the badge, to the license plate visible through the plastic. I had not come here knowing what I would find. I had come here following the logic of an anomaly, following the electricity bill and the insulated wall and the temperature differential and the kind of methodical curiosity that had been my primary survival tool since childhood. But I had brought my phone, and I had a signal, and I used it. I stood in that cold, humming room with 12 preserved vehicles of impossible provenance surrounding me, and I searched what I was seeing against what I knew and what the internet could tell me. And within 20 minutes, I understood that I was not standing in a warehouse anymore. I was standing inside a secret that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep, and that had been sitting under my family's name, quietly drawing electricity and staying exactly the right temperature for longer than anyone had apparently bothered to check. I did not call Mitchell. Not that morning. I called a woman named Patricia Odom, who had been a colleague of mine 15 years earlier at a property management firm, and who had since built a career as an independent estate and asset appraiser with a specialty in high-value private collections. Patricia was methodical and discreet, and she owed me a favor from a situation involving a misdirected shipping manifest and a very anxious client that I had helped her resolve without anyone losing their license. I told her I needed a confidential assessment of a private collection. I told her I could not give her details over the phone, but that I needed her to come prepared for something significant. She said, "How significant?" I said, "Bring your best contacts." She said she could be there in 3 days. Those 3 days were the most disciplined of my life. I went home. I cooked dinner. I watched 2 episodes of a British mystery series I had been working through. I went to bed at a reasonable hour. I did not call Dorothea. I did not call my therapist. I did not tell a single person what I had found because I have learned at considerable cost that information shared prematurely is advantage surrendered unnecessarily. What I knew was mine. What Mitchell did not know was the gap between us. And I intended to keep that gap exactly the width it was until I understood precisely what I was holding. Patricia arrived on a Saturday morning. She drove a sensible gray sedan, and she carried a leather bag that contained, I knew from working with her, a measuring kit, a documentation camera, a tablet loaded with auction records and provenance databases, and the particular expression of a professional who has learned to keep her face neutral until she has a number. I walked her to the main warehouse door. I unlocked it. I led her across the main floor without commentary. I showed her the hole in the drywall. She looked at it. She looked at me. She did not ask a question. She stepped through. I stood in the main warehouse and I listened. I heard her moving. I heard the soft sound of her documentation camera. I heard her footsteps crossing the space from capsule to capsule. I heard her voice once, low and involuntary, the kind of sound that escapes a professional when they encounter something their training did not fully prepare them for. After 40 minutes, she came back through the hole and she stood in front of me and she took off her glasses and pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose and she breathed out slowly through her mouth. Then she said, "Carol, I need to ask you a direct question and I need you to give me a completely honest answer." I said, "All right." She said, "Does the legal owner of this property know what is in that room?" I looked at her steadily. I said, "The legal owner has never set foot in this building in at least 6 years. To my knowledge, he believes this space contains industrial debris and possible hazardous waste residue from a previous tenant." Patricia put her glasses back on. She opened her tablet. She turned it toward me. On the screen was a preliminary valuation summary she had begun drafting on her phone while she was still in the vault. The conservative number at the bottom of the page had 7 figures. I read it twice. I kept my face exactly as neutral as hers. Here is what Patricia told me in the following hour. Sitting on 2 overturned crates in the main warehouse with the cold morning light coming through the barred windows and our breath visible in the air between us. She told me that 3 of the 12 vehicles were definitively identifiable as cinema provenance pieces with documented screen history, and that these 3 alone, if brought to the right auction house with the right marketing narrative, would generate the kind of attention that changes the market around them. She told me that 2 others had identification plates suggesting European origin and pre-war manufacture, and that she would need 48 hours with her contacts to establish their specific lineage, but that her preliminary read was extraordinary. She told me that the collection as a whole, if handled correctly, if the story of its concealment and discovery was told in the right rooms to the right people, was not simply valuable. It was historic. It was the kind of find that gets written about, that gets named. Mitchell called me 4 days later. He wanted to discuss the developer's offer. He wanted to talk about the warehouse as a family. He used the word "we" twice in the first 90 seconds of the call. I let him talk. I listened to the whole proposal. The developer was offering $600,000 for the land, contingent on the property being cleared of all contents and any environmental liability. Mitchell was enthusiastic. He said it was a fair offer given the condition of the building. He said it was time to stop letting a decaying asset drag on the family estate. He said, and this is the part one will carry with me for the rest of my life, he said, "There's nothing in that building worth more than getting it off the books, Carol. It's just a box of old junk and liability. Let it go." I held the phone. I looked out my kitchen window at the dusty sage walls. I said, "You know, Mitchell, I think you might be right that it's time to resolve this." He sounded relieved. He sounded like a man who believes he is managing a situation that has already been decided. He said, "Good. I knew you'd come around." I said, "Let's meet next week. I have some things I'd like to show you." He said, Sure. Nothing complicated, I hope." I said, "No, nothing complicated at all." What happened at that meeting is something I have replayed in my mind more times than I can count, not with satisfaction exactly, though I will not pretend satisfaction was entirely absent. Mostly I replay it because of one moment, one specific, quiet, devastating moment after I slid Patricia's full assessment report across the table to Mitchell and watched him read the first page, and then the second, and then set the papers down and look at me, really look at me, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, with something in his eyes that was not condescension or management or performance. It was recognition. Raw, late, irreversible recognition. He said very quietly, How long have you known? I said, long enough. He said, why didn't you tell me? I looked at him across the table. I said, Mitchell, I never disappeared. You just stopped looking. The room was completely silent. He did not have an answer. In 63 years of watching my brother construct responses to everything, I had never seen him without an answer. The silence stretched out between us and I let it. I did not fill it. I had spent enough of my life filling silences that were not mine to fill. If that line just landed somewhere in you, type truth in the comments. Because what came next, what Mitchell did with that recognition, what the developer's contract actually contained, and what Patricia's contacts uncovered about the origin of those 12 vehicles when they started pulling the thread, none of that resolved the way anyone in that room expected. And I was the only one who was not surprised. The thing about a moment of recognition is that it does not automatically become a moment of change. I want to be precise about this because I think one of the most damaging myths we carry, especially those of us who grew up in families where dysfunction was the wallpaper, is the idea that when the truth finally surfaces, when the person who wronged you finally sees it clearly and completely, something fundamental shifts. That the recognition itself is the repair. It is not. Recognition is just the beginning of a much longer, much less cinematic process. And if you have lived long enough, you already know that. Mitchell saw the assessment report. Mitchell heard what I said. And then Mitchell did what Mitchell had always done when confronted with a reality that threatened his self-image. He called his attorney. I want to tell you exactly how that week unfolded because the details matter in the way that details always matter when someone is trying to rewrite a story that has already been witnessed. Mitchell's attorney, a sharp-edged man named Forrest, who wore his confidence like a second suit, called Patricia the day after our meeting and requested copies of her assessment under the premise that as the legal property owner, Mitchell had the right to all documentation generated on site. Patricia called me immediately after she hung up with him. She said, Carol, I need to know something. When you brought me into that building, what was the basis of your access? I told her about the key. I told her about my history with the property. I told her about the tax payments and the maintenance records and the 17 tab sections of a binder that documented a decade of stewardship that I will had erased in a single paragraph. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you need an attorney. Today. Not tomorrow. I said, I know. She said, a good one. I said, I already made the call. Her name was Renata Voss. She had been recommended to me by Dr. Burgess, which is one of the more unusual referral pathways I have encountered, but which made complete sense when I understood that Renata specialized in estate litigation with a particular focus on cases involving financial elder abuse and undue influence in will amendments. She was in her mid-50s, compact and precise, with the kind of focused intelligence that does not waste energy on performance. She read my binder in one sitting. She looked up at me when she finished and said, you documented everything. I said, I always document everything. She said, good, because documentation is what separates a compelling story from a legal argument. What Renata told me in that first meeting was not what I had hoped to hear, but it was what I needed to hear, and at 63 years old, I have enough mileage to know the difference. She told me that contesting the will at this stage, 7 years after my mother's death, was no longer the most viable path. The statute of limitations had constrained our options on that front. But she told me something else. She told me that the situation with the warehouse had created a new and separate set of legal questions that had nothing to do with the original will and everything to do with what Mitchell had done and failed to do with the property since inheriting it. Here is what Renata found when she started pulling the thread. Mitchell had not paid the property taxes on the warehouse in 4 years. Not because he could not afford to, but because he had, in the disorganized arrogance of a man who treats paperwork as someone else's problem, simply failed to track them. The county had sent notices. The notices had gone to an address Mitchell had listed on the estate filing that was no longer current. The warehouse was 14 months away from a tax lien that would have triggered a forced sale process. Additionally, Mitchell had signed a preliminary letter of intent with the developer without disclosing the full inventory of the property, an inventory he arguably did not know about, but which he was legally obligated to investigate before signing. Renata said the phrase material misrepresentation twice and watched my face while she said it. I kept my expression neutral. I was learning. I want to stop here and talk about something that I think is particularly important for those of us who are in the later chapters of life, because there is a fear that does not get discussed enough. The fear of being the person in the room who does not understand the legal and financial architecture of their own situation until it is too late to change it. My mother did not understand what she was signing when Mitchell brought that attorney to her living room. She understood the surface of it, that she was expressing a preference about the family property, but she did not understand the mechanism, the way a will amendment works, the way a sole beneficiary designation functions, the way the document she signed with 2 witnesses present would operate after she was no longer alive to explain her intentions. She was 81 and tired, and she trusted her son, and she did not know what she did not know. That is not weakness. That is what happens when we do not have someone in our corner who explains the mechanics before we sign, not after. If you are watching this and you have aging parents, or if you are the aging parent, please hear me when I say that the most protective thing you can do is to insist that every significant document be reviewed by an independent attorney, someone who represents only your interests, before it is signed. Not the family attorney. Not the attorney your child recommends. Yours, independent, accountable only to you. I learned this lesson at the cost of 7 years and a warehouse full of irreplaceable history. You do not have to learn it the same way. Renata filed a petition to establish my historical stewardship interest in the property. It was not a dramatic legal maneuver. It was methodical, documented, and built entirely on the binder I had been maintaining for a decade out of nothing more than the habit of a woman who had learned that no one else was going to keep the receipts. She also contacted the developer's legal team directly and informed them of the undisclosed inventory, which immediately complicated Mitchell's preliminary agreement and bought us time. The developer, to his credit, was less interested in conflict than in clarity. He wanted to know what he was buying. When Patricia's full assessment report reached his team, the $600,000 offer was quietly withdrawn. The land, it turned out, was considerably more interesting as a negotiating asset when the contents were part of the conversation. Mitchell called me during this period 3 times. The first call was aggressive. He accused me of sabotaging his sale. He used words I will not repeat here, but that I had heard from him before in various forms, dressed up differently depending on the audience, but carrying the same essential message, which was that my role was to support his decisions, not complicate them. I let him finish. I said, "Mitchell, I think we should let the attorneys handle the conversation from here." He said, "This is a family matter, Carol." I said, "It stopped being only a family matter when you signed a letter of intent without a complete property inventory. That made it a legal matter." He hung up. The second call came 4 days later and was different in register, quieter, with that undercurrent of worry I had heard the first time. He called me about the developer. He asked if we could meet without attorneys. I said I did not think that was a good idea right now. The third call came from Pamela, his wife, which told me that Mitchell had escalated to deploying his secondary communication channel, which was a tactic he had used since childhood when direct approach failed. Pamela said in her carefully modulated voice that she hoped we could resolve things as a family and that Mitchell was under a great deal of stress. I said, "Pamela, I hope he's speaking to someone about that. Stress at this level benefits from professional support." She paused. She said, "Are you suggesting therapy?" I said, I'm suggesting that it helped me enormously, and I think it could help anyone. She did not call back. What Renata ultimately negotiated was not a courtroom verdict. I want to be clear about that because I promised you a realistic story, and I intend to keep that promise. There was no dramatic ruling, no gavel moment, no scene where Mitchell stood publicly accountable in a way that felt proportional to the years of quiet damage. What there was instead was a mediated settlement reached over 3 months of careful, documented, professionally managed conversation that established my formal interest in the contents of the warehouse, independent of the land title, based on my demonstrated stewardship and the paper trail that supported it. Mitchell retained ownership of the land. I retained control of the collection. The vehicles would be handled through a private sale process managed by Patricia and her network, and the proceeds, after legal costs, would reflect the division agreed upon in mediation. Mitchell got a number that allowed him to pay off the back taxes, settle the lien risk, and retain a portion of the sale. It was not nothing, but it was not what he would have received if he had simply paid attention. If you've ever watched someone lose something significant simply because they could not be bothered to look, you know that particular silence. It is not triumphant. It is just the sound of consequence arriving on its own schedule, as it always does, whether we are ready to witness it or not. Subscribe, because what the sale of those vehicles revealed about where they came from and who had hidden them in that warehouse and why is a story that does not end where I thought it ended. And the last part of what I have to tell you is the part that changed how I understand everything that came before it. The sale took 8 months from the day Patricia walked through that hole in the drywall to the day the last vehicle left the warehouse in a climate-controlled transport truck headed for a private auction house in London. 8 months of authentication, provenance research, legal clearance, insurance underwriting, and the particular kind of sustained patience that you only develop after you have spent a lifetime being the person who sees things through while everyone else celebrates the idea and disappears before the work begins. I watched every step of it. I was present for every appraiser's visit, every documentation session, every phone call with the auction house's specialists who flew in from 3 different countries to verify what Patricia had already told me was there. I took notes. I asked questions. I signed nothing without Renata reviewing it first. I was, in other words, exactly who I had always been. The difference was that this time, my name was on the documents that mattered. I want to tell you what the provenance research uncovered because it is the part of this story that I genuinely did not see coming, and I think you deserve to know it because it changes the shape of everything that came before. When Patricia's network began pulling the authentication thread on the collection, they started with the 3 cinema provenance vehicles, which were the most immediately identifiable and therefore the most straightforward to document. What they found confirmed what I had suspected from the moment I pressed my face against that first capsule. The vehicles were real. Their screen histories were real. Their concealment had been deliberate and long-term. But the question that had been sitting quietly at the back of my mind since that first morning in the vault, the question I had not allowed myself to ask too loudly because I needed to stay focused on the legal architecture before I could afford the luxury of curiosity, was this. Who had built that room? Who had installed those dehumidifiers and poured that sealed concrete floor and constructed that false wall and been paying, or not paying, an electricity bill for climate control in a building that my family had owned for 35 years, but never once used for anything that required climate control? The answer came from a man named Gerald Ostroff, who was 87 years old and living in a care facility in Pasadena, and who, when Patricia's provenance specialist tracked him down through a chain of industry contacts and archive records that I will not fully reconstruct here, because it would take another hour, turned out to be the former business partner of my father. Raymond, my father, who I had understood to be a man of modest ambitions and unrealized plans. My father, who had bought a warehouse in 1987 with visions of a small distribution business that never materialized. My father, who had died in 2009 without ever, to anyone's knowledge, explaining what was in the northeastern corner of that building behind a false wall. Gerald Ostroff told Patricia's contact that my father had not simply purchased the warehouse for a distribution business. He had purchased it as a storage arrangement, a private agreement between two men who had worked together briefly in the late 1970s in the peripheral edges of the film industry, not as producers or directors, but as the kind of quiet operational people who handle the logistics that visible people do not want to think about. Gerald said my father had been approached by someone he would not name, even at 87, even with nothing left to protect, about storing a collection of vehicles that needed to disappear from public record for reasons that Gerald described only as complicated and that I have chosen, after considerable reflection, not to investigate further. My father had agreed. He had built the room. He had installed the systems. He had maintained the arrangement quietly for 22 years until he died, and then the arrangement had continued on its own momentum, drawing electricity from the grid and staying exactly the right temperature and waiting, as secrets sometimes do, for someone to finally look closely enough to find it. I sat with this for a long time. I want to be honest about what it felt like, because I think the honest version is more useful than the tidy one. It felt like grief first. A specific, disorienting grief for a version of my father I had not known existed. A man who had been operating in dimensions of his own life that his family had never been invited into. It felt like the particular loneliness of understanding that the people we think we know completely are always, at some level, strangers to us, carrying rooms inside themselves that we never find until it is too late to ask about them. And then, underneath the grief, something else. Something quieter and stranger and harder to name. It felt like recognition, because my father had been doing, in his way, exactly what I had been doing in mine. He had been the keeper of something important that no one else was paying attention to. He had been the spine, and he had left it, whether intentionally or simply because he ran out of time, in the one place he trusted would still be standing when someone finally came looking. He had left it in the warehouse. He had left it for whoever had the key and the patience and the attention to find it. I had been the one with the key. I had been the one with the patience. I do not think that was an accident. I think my father knew his children, perhaps more clearly than they knew themselves, and he left the inheritance where it would find the right person. The settlement figure, when the auction concluded and the accounts cleared and Renata's final distribution summary landed in my inbox on a Tuesday morning in October, was more than I will share publicly, because I think specific numbers invite a kind of attention that is not useful, and because the number is not actually the point. The point is what I did with it. I paid off the remaining balance on my apartment, and then I bought it outright. I established a proper estate plan, reviewed by Renata and structured with the clarity and independence that my mother's was not, with a healthcare directive and a durable power of attorney assigned to Dorothea, who I trust with my life, and a will that says exactly what I mean in language that leaves no room for amendment by someone bearing coffee and pastries on a Saturday morning. I made a donation to a legal aid organization that provides estate planning assistance to elderly people who cannot afford private attorneys, because I believe that the situation my mother found herself in, signing a document she did not fully understand because she trusted the wrong person, is not a personal failing. It is a systemic gap, and gaps can be filled if enough people decide they are worth addressing. I kept the watercolors going. I am still not particularly good at them. Rosaria, my instructor, told me recently that my sense of color has developed considerably and that I was still holding my brush slightly too tight. I am working on it. Mitchell and I are not close. I want to be truthful about that because I think the pressure to perform family reconciliation, especially for women of my generation, is itself a form of erasure. The expectation that the person who was wrong should also be the person who does the emotional labor of rebuilding the relationship. That forgiveness should look like proximity. That healing should be demonstrated through dinner invitations, accepted, and old patterns resumed. I do not subscribe to that. Mitchell and I speak occasionally. The conversations are civil and brief, and carefully bounded in a way that I manage without apology. He has never said the words, "I am sorry," in a form that was not immediately followed by a qualifier. He has never acknowledged, directly and without deflection, the specific nature of what he did. I do not wait for it anymore. Waiting for acknowledgement from someone who is not capable of offering it is just another form of giving them authority over your peace. And I am done allocating authority I have not deliberately chosen to assign. What I have instead is this. I have a life that I built in the 7 years when everyone who had underestimated me believed I was simply managing my disappointment. I have a name on documents that matter. I have a therapist I still see monthly because I believe that maintenance is not weakness. It is intelligence, the same intelligence that keeps a climate-controlled room at exactly the right temperature so that the things worth preserving do not deteriorate while no one is watching. I have Dorothea, who has been my witness for 30 years and who, when I called her after the auction cleared and told her the full number, said absolutely nothing for 10 seconds, and then said, "Carol, your father knew." And I said, "I think so too." And we sat on the phone in comfortable silence for a while. The way you can only sit with someone who has watched you become yourself over decades and does not need to fill every quiet with noise. I am not closing the door on Mitchell. I want to be precise about that distinction because it matters to me. Closing the door is a dramatic gesture. It is binary and final, and it carries its own kind of weight that I do not want to carry. What I have instead is a door that is mine. I decide how wide it opens. I decide who stands in the frame. I decide what the visit costs and whether the cost is worth it. That is not coldness. That is the specific, hard-won warmth of a woman who finally understands that her home is her own and that hospitality is a choice, not an obligation inherited from a family dynamic that never asked whether she consented to the role. The warehouse is empty now. The vehicles are gone. Mitchell sold the land 6 months after the auction to a developer who is building mixed-use residential units that will probably be called something like the Raymond, because that is what developers do. They name things after the history they are erasing. I drove past the site last month. The building is gone. The rolling door and the barred windows and the rotting brick and the false wall and the humming dehumidifiers and the green blinking lights and the 12 inflatable capsules are all gone. There is a chain link fence and a foundation being poured and a sign with a rendering of what it will look like when it is finished. I sat in my car and I looked at the empty lot and I thought about my father building that room with his own hands and his own secrets and his own particular brand of quiet intention. I thought about the 11-year-old girl at the kitchen sink with soap on her elbows being told she was the spine. I thought about Gerald Hines in his bow tie reading a document that erased 8 years of my labor in a single paragraph. I thought about the morning I walked through a hole in a wall and found 12 impossible things waiting in the dark. And I thought about what it means to be the kind of person who keeps the key, who drives out once a year just to check the locks, who takes notes on legal pads and underlines things twice and does not stop looking simply because everyone else has decided there is nothing left worth seeing. If there is one thing I want to leave you with, it is this. The people who underestimate you are not always doing it out of malice. Sometimes they are doing it because your competence is so consistent that it has become invisible to them, like infrastructure, like the systems that keep the lights on and the temperature right and the valuable things preserved. They stop seeing it because it never fails. And because it never fails, they stop imagining what would happen if you simply stopped. Let them wonder. Keep your key. Keep your notes. Keep showing up to the building that everyone else has written off. because sometimes the most important thing in the room is behind the wall that nobody thought to look behind. And the person who finds it is always the one who never stopped paying attention. Drop in the comments and tell me, what is the thing in your life that you have been quietly tending that nobody else has noticed yet? Because I have a feeling this room is full of spines. And next time, I want to tell you about a woman who discovered at 71 years old that the modest little savings account her late husband had never mentioned was not modest at all, and that the bank had known about it for 9 years and said nothing. That story starts somewhere you will not expect. And it ends somewhere that will make you want to call your own bank first thing in the morning.